A lot of the talk about the Jets this offseason is about bringing in outside players to fill the team's needs. But there's one internal free agent who should be a top priority. Let's talk about who that is today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, February 4th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And our episode today is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about Jets players who are about to hit free agency. Now, a lot of the discussion around the Jets has been about which players are they going to bring in this offseason to fill their holes. However, this team also has an awful lot of free agents about to hit the open market. We're going to talk about which players the Jets should try to keep. And if we're being honest, there really are not many. Most of the players the Jets have who are about to hit free agency are either very low-level guys or big names who really were disappointments, and there's really no way the Jets should be looking to bring them back. But there are a couple of players the Jets should look to resign, including one guy who I would say is the top priority. And that, of course, is Haason Reddick. Okay, bad joke. Obviously not Haason Reddick. Obviously Haason Reddick falls in the category of big names the Jets should let go. But I'm sorry, I had to have one bad joke. The guy who is the top priority, though, who's about to hit free agency, I think, is Jamien Sherwood. And what an interesting season it was for Jamien Sherwood, because entering training camp, he was viewed as kind of a part-time player. He was supposed to be the number 3 linebacker in a defense that typically plays 2 linebackers. Jets, for the most part, were a 4-2-5 defense, 4 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, 5 defensive backs. Sherwood was the number 3 linebacker. So your number 3 linebacker, he's a situational guy. He'll play against heavy formations when the other team either plays a fullback or 2 tight ends. But Sherwood ended up playing a very prominent role this past season because C.J. Mosley spent most of it injured. Of course, Mosley's on the wrong side of 30, and this season it kind of felt like Mosley started to break down. Mosley has had a long and productive career in the NFL. He has had a Jets career which had moments, but overall was a bit of a disappointment. One of the things I think the Jets have failed at a lot through the years is internal scouting. I think that they've made a lot of mistakes evaluating their own internal talent, and sometimes it comes in the form of overestimating guys who are on your roster, what they're capable of producing. We've seen that over and over and over again, where the Jets just aren't really realistic about what their roster is, where it is. It comes in terms of evaluating players. It also has happened in terms of how you approach certain moves. The Jets trading for Devontae Adams at a point where they were 2-4 and thinking Adams was going to put them over the top and make them a Super Bowl team was not very realistic. But there also are instances where maybe the Jets don't appreciate what they have on their roster. And I think that may have happened this past year with Jamien Sherwood because, again, they were entering the season as though he was going to be a backup player, as he was going to be a part-time guy, a guy who plays in sub packages against heavy formations, again, run situations. And he ends up stepping into the lineup and playing great for the Jets. He finished the season with 158 tackles. He ended up getting voted by his teammates as the team MVP. And taking it a step further, 158 tackles is good, but you can't judge players, especially linebackers, solely on their tackle counts because how many of those come when you're jumping on a guy 9 yards down the field and the tackle doesn't really help. And the other aspect of this is, which doesn't get talked about enough, is sometimes you have a very favorable scorekeeper at home. The people who decide the tackling stats are scorekeepers, and on any given play, you can have a guy get a tackle, but you can also add assisted tackles. A couple of guys can get an assist, and the assists count just the same as the solo tackle. So there are some guys who really pump their stats out by producing at home. So you can't always go purely on the tackle stats. But one stat that jumped out to me is Jamien Sherwood was just outside the top 10 in run stops, and run stops are tackles that result in a failure for the offense. It means the offense just doesn't gain a whole lot. It depends on how run stop is categorized, depends on what the down and distance. But at the end of the day, a run stop is considered a failure for the offense. And Sherwood was just outside the top 10 there. Now, I remember when the Jets drafted Sherwood on day 3 of the 2021 draft, And there was a lot of skepticism because the Jets were converting him from safety to linebacker. And they did the same thing with another guy who they drafted in day 3, Hamza Nasruddin out of Florida State. But I always felt like that skepticism was a bit unfair because, first of all, Sherwood is not the first safety to convert to linebacker. I mean, it's happened with a lot of guys through the history of the league. Guy who played with the Jets, Bart Scott, was a safety in college, and the Ravens converted him to a linebacker. When you're trying to add speed, and the Jets defense under Robert Saleh was based a lot on speed, especially in the back seven, there's a logic to moving a guy from safety to linebacker. Safeties are usually faster than linebackers. They usually have a similar skill set. They have to play downhill against the run. They have to cover running backs and tight ends. But when you're at linebacker, your coverage situation is a little bit easier for the most part because you do have the safeties over the top of you. Whereas if you're at safety, you have to be, you typically don't have as much help. So it's in many ways, it depends on your skill set, and this is an oversimplification, but safety is a simpler position to play for than linebacker. And if you're looking for speed on your defense, converting a safety to a linebacker makes a lot of sense. And I don't know that the Jets realized what they had in Sherwood, because again, this was a guy, and there was not a lot of competition, if we're being honest, but Sherwood did finish the season as the team MVP. And this goes back to, I could criticize them for the way they've handled CJ Mosley, because essentially the Jets have used CJ Mosley's contract the last couple of years like a second mortgage. It's like whenever they needed to create cap space, they just restructured Mosley's contract and pushed more dead money to the future. That, above all other contracts, is like the one the Jets really have not handled all that well. And this was a situation where the Jets had a young guy who was ready to step into a prominent role. And he did because of injury, and he played really well there. And I just think it would be tough to watch Jamien Sherwood blossom after 3 years of the Jets developing him. When he started out as a guy who was just, kind of a practice, a guy you're trying to develop on the practice field, a backup. Then a year ago, he stepped into that third linebacker role and did a pretty solid job. And then this year, he finally develops into a full-time starter. It would be tough to watch this guy develop for 4 years in a Jets uniform and watch some other team reap the fruits of the Jets' labor. And I'm always of the mindset that, and this is something I believe in, and sometimes I'm wrong on this. I would think I was wrong when I said the Jets should bring back Bryce Huff, but I really believe that when you develop guys, you should try and keep them. You're much better off trying to keep your own guys than you are trying to bring in guys from the outside, because guys from the outside are succeeding in a different circumstance. They're succeeding in a different system. Guys in your team are succeeding in the same system. Now, okay, new coaching staff, so maybe that doesn't quite apply. But Sherwood is still very widely respected in the locker room. That team MVP I told you about, his teammates are the ones who voted on it. His teammates said he was the most valuable player on the team. So it shows you how respected he is in the locker room. And I think when you're installing a new defense, that middle linebacker, that guy who's kind of the point guy on defense, he's really important. And Sherwood's shown he can handle that role. Again, new system, I understand, but he's the guy who's going to get everyone up to speed on Aaron Glenn's defense, Aaron Glenn and Steve Wilkes' defense. So I think Sherwood's a guy with a lot of value. We know the Jets have very limited salary cap space this offseason. And one thing I believe is that the Jets should be focused on their own guys. The Jets should be focused on these players who are about to enter their prime, because as rough as this past season was, and as difficult the perception is of where the Jets are as a franchise, they're not that far away if they just build around this core. But building around this core also means keeping this core in place. And to me, the top priority, the top, maybe second to re-signing Garrett Wilson, but among guys who are about to hit free agency, the top priority far and away is locking up Jamien Sherwood and turning him into a long-term Jet. Because I've said this in the context of other players, the only thing that will turn the perception around the Jets for the Jets around in the league is winning. But second to that is getting guys who have been here show that they still want to be here. That's an important first step, and that will help you win. Keeping Jamien Sherwood around will help you win. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I don't think there's anybody else I'm that passionate about staying, but there are a couple of guys who I think at the right price, in the right role, could make sense for the Jets to bring back, including a widely respected guy who plays a critical role and could help complete an important spot on the team. We'll talk about who that is as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. The big game's almost here, and there's no better way to make it even more exciting than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With over 10 million members and billions of winnings awarded, Prize Picks makes it fun and simple to get in on the action. And here's how it works. You pick more or less on at least two player projections, and if you're right, you could win up to 1,000 times your cash. PrizePicks even has a free pick for the big game where Patrick Mahomes only needs to throw for 1 yard to win. Pair that with one more correct pick, and you're cashing out. You can check out the promos tab to tail any of the super sweet Millie winners big game lineups. If you tail a lineup that goes 3 for 3, you can split $1 million in promo funds. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, it's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space. LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks. Run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Jets free agents. Jets have a lot of guys who have expiring contracts. They do not have a lot of guys with expiring contracts worth keeping. The good about this team is that, like, the core that I mentioned, the draft class of 2021, 2022, it gives the Jets a good foundation. Unfortunately, pretty much everybody outside that group is not that valuable. So there just aren't a lot of guys worth keeping. I mean, do you want to keep Tyron Smith? I'm guessing no. However, the guy that played across from Tyron Smith, Morgan Moses, that could be a different story. Now, if you're an everydayer and you've been listening to the podcast, even going back to the season, I've been conflicted on Morgan Moses, whether or not the Jets should keep him or not, because on the one hand, he is just a consummate professional. He's not a flashy guy. But, you need guys like Morgan Moses who, first of all, are dependable. He's going to be on the field. He's going to do his job professionally, even if he's not going to be a superstar. Great offensive lines are not built on 5 phenomenal players. They're built on a couple of stars and then some guys who just do their job really effectively, do their job professionally. And that's what Morgan Moses does. And I think one of my biggest regrets in recent Jets memories is that Morgan Moses hasn't spent more of his time with the Jets. He's been here 2 seasons, 2021, and the Jets let him go after that season, which in hindsight was a mistake. Like, I don't want to act like I was screaming about the Jets letting Morgan Moses go at the time. So I'm not going to go overboard on that. But in hindsight, letting him go after the 2021 season was a mistake. Well, the Jets undid that mistake by trading for him before the start of last season. And Moses did, a professional, solid job. He missed a little bit of time due to injuries, but for the most part was on the field, played through some really painful stuff. And, at a point where the Jets season was over, he was still playing through injuries. This was a lost season for the Jets. And I think it says a lot about his professionalism. They stayed on the field. They battled through stuff. He was playing less than 100%. That said, Morgan Moses, you're talking about a 34-year-old. And you're also talking about a guy who, while he was effective, you can see just some of his statistics, his pressure rate, things along those lines. There's deterioration where it's not bad yet, but it's not as good as it used to be. And while he stayed on the field for the most part, while he gutted through some injuries, he missed time, which has not been typical of him. Normally, he's been an Iron Man. So you're starting to see the slow deterioration of Morgan Moses. So I don't think the Jets should re-sign him to a big contract. I don't even think the Jets should bring him back as the undisputed starter. But here's where I view Moses, is that I know everything I just said. I told you about his age. I told you about he's declining a little bit. Every other team knows this stuff too. So I feel like there's a pretty good chance that Morgan Moses is the type of guy who's probably going to be available after the draft. I don't know that anybody's going to rush to sign him. And look, if somebody's going to put up big money, I think the Jets should maybe move on because, you always want to let a guy go a year too early than a year too late. But I think there is a price where it makes sense for the Jets to bring Morgan Moses back. And I think there's a situation where it makes sense. Now, I think the Jets should be looking for a longer-term starter at the right tackle position. And maybe that's through the draft. Maybe there's a younger guy available in free agency this year. And one thing you do see in the NFL, especially these days, is players can be late bloomers on the offensive line. They can struggle early in their careers, and then they sign with their second team. And that's where they start to put the pieces together. And I think a lot of this goes back to the way they're trained in college, because one thing I discuss frequently on the show is college offenses don't really train offensive linemen to play in the NFL. You don't have a lot of drop back passing in college anymore because of the rules in college, because of the offensive systems. In college, offensive linemen can go down the field 3 yards before they're in an eligible man downfield versus 1 yard in the NFL, which just makes the screen game so much easier to operate in college. So the screen game can essentially be your passing game in college, where in a way it can't in the NFL because linemen are able to go so much further down the field in college, three times the distance down the field before they're ineligible. And that means you don't get the training, you don't get the coaching, the instruction on how to pass block effectively in the drop back passing game. So there are guys who develop later on. And that's so maybe the Jets find somebody in free agency who's in their mid-20s who fits that description. But it's also possible maybe the Jets draft somebody. And I think about the situation the Jets had at the left tackle position this year. Jets drafted Olu Fashanu 11th overall. They brought in Tyron Smith. I'm going to say something that's going to be controversial. I actually think, looking back, signing Tyron Smith was a good move and worth it. And here's why I say that. I don't think Tyron Smith was good when you compare him to what expectations were. I think if you compare Tyron Smith's 2024 to the rest of Tyron Smith's career, it was a failure. I think if you're looking for the context of where the Jets were, where they were trying to make a Super Bowl run, and you needed not just a solid left tackle, you needed a great left tackle. You needed somebody who could lift the offensive line by himself. From that standpoint, Tyron Smith was a failure. But if you look at the money the Jets actually paid Tyron Smith versus what he gave them probably like a low-level starter performance before he went out in November against the Arizona Cardinals, suffered that season-ending injury. And there's value in that, especially for what the Jets paid for him. And there was also a value in, I think, buying time for Olu Fashanu to get ready, because you watched Olu Fashanu early in the season, and it was a struggle. And I know Olu wasn't playing left tackle. I know he filled in for Moses some of the time after Moses got injured. And I know, he played some guard. And look, left tackle is his natural position. I don't want to completely dismiss the idea that once he stepped in at left tackle, things were much better, because I think there is an element of truth to that. But I also think physically, Olu Fashanu just wasn't ready at the start of the season. You watched him, he was being dominated in a way that just suggested he wasn't up to speed. He was still adjusting to NFL player strength. And I think that time that Tyron Smith was at left tackle, I'm not saying Tyron Smith was good, but I'm saying he wasn't Connor McDermott bad. He wasn't like the guys the Jets were running out there late season and lost years were like the third string left tackle. Tyron Smith was a low level starter at left tackle. There is value in that. And there was value in buying Olu Fashanu some time. And if you can get back Morgan Moses on a cheap deal, and maybe you draft somebody, maybe Morgan Moses is the guy who buys you those 6 to 8 weeks before the new guy is ready to step in. Again, I think there's some nuance here. I don't think the Jets should go out and give Morgan Moses 2 years guaranteed. I don't think the Jets should give Morgan Moses $10 million a year. But if Morgan Moses is available and you can get him on a cheap deal, and your focus is on finding your long-term right tackle, I think that could be something worthwhile for the New York Jets. Because for the first time in maybe a decade, maybe more, the Jets' offensive line actually looks like it's got some pieces to work with. Olu Fashanu, once Tyron Smith went down in November, Olu Fashanu had a very strong finish to the season. John Simpson, one of Joe Douglas's best signings. Joe Douglas did not do a good job in the free agent game. Joe Douglas did not do a good job in the free agent game on the offensive line. That was a good signing. Then you have Joe Tippmann, solid center. Elijah Vera Tucker finally stayed healthy for the most part this year. And you have AVT. The story's always been if he stays healthy, he's good. Finally stayed healthy and was good. So right tackle is really the last spot where you need somebody. This is a good offensive. Finally, we have an offensive line that looks like it's got some pieces in place. We're not just trying to talk ourselves into it during the offseason. Right tackle is the last spot. Maybe Morgan Moses could be a bridge to the final piece of the on the offensive line. That's your Locked On Jets podcast. We'll turn our attention to a critical position, but maybe not a starter at a critical position. A guy who could provide needed depth at that position. We'll talk about who that is and why it's important continuing here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Are you looking for tickets for your next big event? Maybe last-minute tickets to the big game next week? Whether it's a concert, a comedy show, or a sports game, finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache. But with Game Time Picks, it's never been easier. Let me tell you how it works. With Game Time Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals so you don't have to waste time searching through endless tickets. And the best part, you get covered with Game Time's lowest price guaranteed. If you find a better deal somewhere else, they will refund 110% of the difference. Plus, your tickets are guaranteed to be delivered on time with easy cancellation options if something comes up. It's true. I talk about Game Time all the time, but I actually use Game Time. It's super convenient. I've always made my orders last minute, but I've always gotten the tickets on time. They have all in pricing, so no hidden fees. You know how much you're paying before you buy, and the view from your seat. I love that too. You get a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat, so no surprises when you arrive at your venue. Are you ready to make your next event even better? Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. In terms of play, again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space. LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Once again, a big shout out to you every day. This is the daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And we're talking about guys we want to continue talking about for the New York Jets as the calendar turns to 2025. Who are Jets free agents they should look to retain? And I'm going to close out by talking about the cornerback position, a critical position on the defensive side of the ball. Now, in a normal circumstance, I might be talking about DJ Reed, because DJ Reed was an excellent signing by Joe Douglas. As I said before when I was talking about John Simpson, Joe Douglas did not do a lot right in free agency, but there were some big successes. And DJ Reed was absolutely one of them. A home run signing 3 years ago. In fact, I would even say the best Jets free agent signing of the 21st century. When you combine positional value versus the level of play versus the salary, that was just a slam. That was a home run, slam dunk, whatever metaphor from another sport you want to use. That was a phenomenal signing by Joe Douglas. The problem, though, is that DJ Reed was pretty much telling everybody before the end of the season, I'm out of here. I don't want to be here anymore. Now, could the signing of Aaron Glenn as head coach change things? Could having a top-notch corner who also was like DJ Reed, Aaron Glenn was kind of an undersized corner who made it work, who had success, different styles of play. But Glenn's known as kind of a player's coach, a guy who motivates. Could that change DJ Reed's mind? Perhaps, but I'm working under the premise until I hear otherwise that DJ Reed's out the door. There's another corner who's about to hit free agency for the Jets, though. But it's a guy who, I don't think he should be like the top priority, but he's a guy I'd like to keep around for depth, and that's Brandin Echols. And I'm not saying Echols should step into a starting role because he's not a starting caliber corner, but I think is like your number 4, number 5 corner. He's actually pretty good. And here's the funny thing about the Jets is we look back to that 2021 draft class, and the Jets had 3 of the top 35 picks, and they really messed it up because they whiffed on the quarterback second overall, Zach Wilson. Then they whiffed on Elijah Moore early in the second round. So you look at that draft and you say, man, they messed up on 2. They had 3 early picks. They messed up 2 of them. Terrible draft class. But actually, you look at it and look, anytime you whiff on a quarterback second overall, that's going to be the story. But outside of that, they did get Elijah Vera Tucker. They traded up for AVT, which maybe they shouldn't have traded up for him, but AVT's been a pretty good player. You look at what they did on day 3 of that draft. We talked about Sherwood, who's turned into a success story. Michael Carter II, excellent slot. Bad 2024, but a guy who's been another success story as a slot corner. You can make a case the Jets got 3 quality starters out of that draft. And they also got Brandin Echols out of Kentucky in the 6th round. And Echols spent 1 year as a starter in 2021 as a rookie and kind of struggled. But I think it's turned into a good depth corner. Again, you don't want, especially in a defense where you're going to blitz and play a lot of man-to-man, I don't think you want Echols as a starter. I don't think he's starting material. But what do you want in a backup? You want a guy who can play a little inside and outside. I think Echols can do that. You want a guy who's not going to be a disaster if you play him for a game or 2. That's true of Echols, I think. The other thing with Echols is if the ball is thrown to him, he's not going to drop it. He had interceptions this year, and I don't want to make it act like Echols is a ball hawk because, frankly, if you watch the interceptions, it's not all what he did. There was mistakes by the quarterbacks, but how many times do we watch a Jets guy or watch any NFL game? You see a defensive back drop an easy interception. Echols catches it when it comes to him. Those are game-changing plays. So, you make a mistake, Echols will make you pay for it. So I'm going to temper my comments about Brandin Echols because, again, I think he is a backup. I don't think he's a starter. I think he's a solid backup, though. And one of the things you learn is there is value in having guys who are good depth players. There is value in having guys who are good backups. If Echols has to play 17 games for you, you're going to be in trouble. But if there's an injury to one of your top 2 guys and you need somebody to get you through 2-3 games, it can make a big difference having a guy who can play, especially at the corner position, because in a defense, in most defenses, and especially in a defense like the one Aaron Glenn and Steve Wilks are going to run, there's no place to hide a corner. If you are bad at corner, you will get picked on over and over and over and over again. And I do believe that there's something to be said for the idea that on the defensive side of the ball, no position loses you games through bad play quicker and more than the corner position. Not everybody's a superstar. Not everybody's Sauce Gardner. Some guys are just, they're good as role guys. They're good in short spurts. They have enough skill to survive against, competition that is not elite if they only have to do it for a short time. I think that's where Brandin Echols fits. I think that's kind of his game. And you should always be looking to develop depth through the draft, late round picks. I mean, that's real. The good teams are able to find players who fit their systems, guys who have the skill sets you need to make your system work at that position. That's something the Jets should absolutely look to do. But it's good to have a backup with experience as well. You find the right mix. Maybe you have one backup who's developing, who's a guy you just drafted. You try and work with him on the practice field. You try and develop his skill set. But also good to have an experienced guy you can turn to, somebody who's dependable, somebody who can do the job. And I know Brandin Echols is not going to have the biggest fan base among Jets fans. I know that he's not going to excite anybody if he's brought back. I don't think the Jets should pay a lot of money. I think they should probably pay him the minimum. But if he's willing to come back at the minimum, I think he's a guy who's proven to be an asset. For a guy who was a late round pick, we're not talking about a first round pick. For a guy who's a late round pick, that's pretty much giving you what you wanted from him. He's developed into a quality backup. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, please give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody, and send in your mailbag questions. Unless there's some big news that breaks tomorrow, we're going to do our weekly mailbag. Can't wait to talk to you then.